On May 31st, 2024, I got my second ever reptile, a Leachianus gecko. He was only 3 weeks old and a couple inches long when I got him, and has since grown into an absolute beast. Believe it or not, this is only about half of his final size. A couple weeks after I got him, I had decided to make a custom-made temporary enclosure that had plenty of hiding spaces, plants, and areas for him to explore. Over a year later, he's completely destroyed the tank and killed all of the plants. I don't blame him though. This enclosure was a great grow-out tank, but he needs something a lot larger that will better serve his needs. So today I'm going to make a brand new custom-built bioactive enclosure and give the big man the home he deserves. If you're new around here, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss future uploads, and leave a like if you enjoyed the video. I started by moving this custom-built enclosure onto a stand. I have a full video on how I made this if you want to check it out, but this is the same size as I used for my crested gecko. The dimensions are 24 all around, and this will be the perfect canvas to start our build. To kick things off, I'll go ahead and measure the width of the back of the enclosure as well as the sides. I'll also measure the height and transfer these measurements onto a sheet of XPS foam. This will be the base of our background, so I'll go ahead and line up a ruler with the measurements and cut along the edge with a razor blade. I'll run it through a couple of times before snapping the foam in half and repeating this process a couple more times until I have all 3 of the background panels cut. Before we can continue work on these, I need to account for the hardscape, so I'll go ahead and dry fit the panels. I wanted these to be a bit snug in the enclosure as I won't be siliconing them later for ease of dismantling in the future. With all the background panels in place, I can now move on to the hardscape using exclusively cork tubes. Leechies are a very large species of gecko. Cork tubes are the perfect hardscape element as they provide plenty of climbing surface as well as adequate hiding space. In addition to that, they provide a great visual barrier in the enclosure, which is great for aesthetic reasons and good enrichment for the animal. In terms of the scape itself, I started by placing the largest element in first. It's a beautiful piece of cork bark covered in dry moss and lichen, and I've been saving it specifically for this build. I worked the other pieces of bark around this, and used extra pieces of XPS foam to hold up elements while I work. After a couple hours of scaping, I came up with this layout. I'm honestly in love with this scape. It not only looks good, but it also provides those visual barriers and hiding spots that I talked about earlier. Before I can secure everything in place, I'll use a Sharpie to mark where the hardscape elements sit on the background. This will help me reassemble the scape later on. In addition to this, I also added a couple more areas on the background that I'll build up later to create depth. On the right side, I made sure to raise one of the areas up a little more to account for a place to set the food dish. I then continued drawing patterns on the right side of the background before coming back and marking each of the supports with a number. This will further help me to reassemble the scape later as close as possible to the original. Once all of this was done, I could now start dismantling the scape very carefully. I should mention too that I did take a couple pictures of the scape, so I have a reference to go off of later. Once all of the hardscape elements were removed from the enclosure, I could now remove all of the background panels. With the hardscape now accounted for, we can finally start work on the actual backgrounds. The first order of business is to take care of those raised up areas that I mentioned earlier. To do this, I'll start by drawing the pattern onto another sheet of XPS foam and then cutting it out with a razor blade. Once that's done, I can simply snap it off the rest of the foam and repeat this process over the entirety of the background, occasionally doubling up layers. To secure these in place, I'll use a bit of hot glue applied to the bottom of the foam and then press the pieces firmly together. I can repeat the process on the second piece and press it firmly into the background itself. Raising up areas on the background helps to create more depth and a more realistic look for the background. Once all the pieces are firmly secured in place, I'll come back with a wire brush drill bit and start shaping them up a bit. Using this technique is a great way to shape up some of those edges and add a realistic texture to your backgrounds. While I'm carving, I'm making sure not to cover up those markers that I made earlier so that I know where to put the scape. I continued this process for the back and left background panels, but for the right side I need to account for that food dish. I'll go ahead and set the food dish on top of the foam and use a Sharpie to mark the bottom of it. After that, I can come back with a variety of different drill bits and start carving out the hole. After a little bit of work and test fitting, you can see that the food dish fits snugly in place. With the food dish ledge now accounted for, I can start to carve this panel like I did the others. Now that we have all of the background panels carved, we can go ahead and pass over each one with a heat gun. This will not only harden up the foam, but will also help to bring out some of that texture. I also like to run over each piece with a bit of sandpaper to soften up some of those sharp edges. Now we can move on to the painting process, and for that I'll be using some white tintable drylock colored with concrete pigments. I'll pour a good amount of each into a small container and mix it up until I have a dark blackish gray color. This will serve as our primary base coat, so I'll start applying it to the backgrounds. This is the coat that's going to end up bringing out the texture and depth later, so I'll make sure to apply it in a very thick layer covering the entirety of the background. Once that's done, we can come back with the secondary base coat and lightly brush it over the surface. This will be the primary color of the background. Next, we can come back with a slightly lighter coat and repeat the same process. Using progressively lighter coats and colors helps to bring out the depth and texture in the background and makes for a more realistic look. To finish things off, I'll brush over each background panel with a very light brown color to serve as a final highlight coat. Now that all the background panels are done, we can install them back into the enclosure. Everything's already looking great, but we need to add the scape back in to finish off the look. This is where having all of those markers on the background as well as the numbered supports comes in handy. This extra step in preparation allows me to reassemble the scape with ease. Everything was going pretty smooth and the scape was fitting in just fine, so I continued working until I had the scape fully reassembled. To keep the cork tubes in place and to make a seamless transition between the scape and the background, I'll use a bit of Great Stuff Gaps and Cracks expanding foam applied to any connection points. Using this technique allows me to form the background to the cork tubes, creating a more natural appearance. After allowing the foam to cure for a couple hours, I came back and removed all of the supports. Then I can go ahead and take care of the foam. The best technique I've found for this is just ripping it off with your fingers. Ideally, I'd like to use something like a wire brush drill bit or even a wire brush, but I've tried those techniques in the past and it's just too difficult to get them into this tight of a space. Using my fingers gives me more accessibility to different areas and it creates a pretty natural look overall. I work my way around the enclosure, carving all of the foam in as much of an organic way as possible. As you can see, the foam leaves quite a mess at the bottom of the enclosure, so before proceeding with the project, I need to clean this up real quick. Once that's done, we can move on to painting the foam. To do this, I'll be using the exact same technique that I used on the background. I'll start with the black base coat and then work my way through the other progressively lighter coats to get the final look. This is always the fun part of the build because this is where it brings everything together and makes for that natural look. I added the final highlight coat to finish everything up, and now we can move on to the false bottom using some Leca clay pebbles. Though these are already pre-soaked, I'll go ahead and pour a bag of them into a bucket and let them soak for about an hour. Doing this will ensure that they won't absorb too much moisture from the substrate, depriving the plants of water. Once this is done, I can go ahead and pour it into the enclosure and spread it around to get an even layer. With the drainage layer of the enclosure now in place, we can go ahead and use some landscaping fabric to create a substrate barrier between the substrate and the false bottom. I cut a piece to size and inserted it into the enclosure, tucking it beneath the background to ensure that no substrate will get through. Speaking of substrate, we can now start the process of mixing it. I'll use a variety of different components for this custom ABG mix, and I'll put all the ratios up on screen in case you want to make this mix yourself. I find this mix to be perfect for tropical substrates as it has very good drainage, stays light and fluffy, while also retaining plenty of moisture. I added all of the components into a bucket and began to thoroughly mix it all up. As you can see, this mix contains activated charcoal, so that will negate the need for a dedicated layer. After mixing everything up for a couple minutes, we now have the perfect tropical substrate for our vivarium. We can now add the substrate into the bottom of the vivarium. One thing I do with all of my builds is slope up the substrate towards the back. This helps to create a better sense of depth and in my opinion just looks better in most cases. I continued adding substrate to the enclosure until I had an adequate layer. With the substrate now in place, we can move on to the plants. Since we don't want any of the existing substrate on the plants, I'll go ahead and remove as much as possible from the roots. As you can see, I'm using a very small and unique set of plants for this build that's a lot different from what I normally do. I'll explain more on this in a bit. Once I've removed as much of the soil as possible, I'll take the plants over to the sink and rinse them out with a little bit of water. This will help to remove any of the remaining soil as well as get rid of any fertilizers that may be present. It's never bad to take further precautions, but I've used this technique in the past and had no issues with it. To start off the planting, I'm adding a Dracaena to the bottom left of the enclosure. I'll then get a small bird's nest snake plant and situate that just to the left of it. I'll add another slightly darker one to the right side of the enclosure. I'll finish things off by adding a couple pothos to the back of the enclosure, but I wanted to take some time to explain why I chose these plants. As I mentioned at the beginning of the video, lychee geckos are very large, so making sure that I have hardy plants that can withstand that much pressure and wear is very important. In addition to this, keeping the planting minimal will ensure that I don't take too much space away from the gecko. It's a lot different from what I normally do, but I was able to make it work. To make this thing fully bioactive, we'll add the cleanup crew, which consists of powder blue isopods, a colony of dwarf white isopods, and some springtails that I cultivated myself. To give them a hiding spot and some food, as well as enhance that natural look, I'll add a mix of willow and oak leaf litter to the bottom of the enclosure. I'll top this off with some botanicals to complete the naturalistic look, and then give the whole tank a good mist to boost humidity. Then it was time to introduce the big man to his brand new home. And that's how I made a beautiful bioactive enclosure for my Leachianus gecko. This build was kind of an interesting one. The way I had to do the plants in the hardscape presented somewhat of a challenge, but I think I did pretty well all things considered. As I said earlier, he's going to get a lot bigger, so making sure to provide that space for him was a must. Additionally, I wanted to use cork from the beginning, as you can see here just how well their camouflage is to the cork bark. He still hasn't done much in the enclosure and is still hiding and settling in, so I don't have a whole lot of shots of him, but that's just fine with me. On a side note, another cool thing is seeing this enclosure right up next to my crested gecko one. I've had this planned out for a while, so finally seeing this come to fruition is really cool. Overall, I really love this enclosure. There's something beautiful about the simplicity of it, and the challenge that it brought makes it more meaningful to me. Something about the way the plants weave in and out of the scape is just beautiful, and I hope that he ends up enjoying it as much as I do. Anyway, that's going to do it for this week. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe, and I'll see you all in the next one.